Caregiving does not usually bankrupt families overnight. It happens one decision at a time. You pay for something mom needs because she cannot. You miss work because there's no one else to stay with dad. You dip into your savings because you tell yourself it's only temporary. Then your retirement, then your credit cards. And one day, you look around and realize you spent years protecting someone else's future while quietly sacrificing your own. Hi, I'm Dr. Mark Ropoleski, and this is the Caregivers Podcast. Today, I'm joined by caregiving expert Amy Goyer, whose own caregiving journey ultimately led to personal bankruptcy. If you ever laying awake at night wondering how much longer you can keep paying for caregiving or whether caring for someone you love is slowly putting your own future at risk, this conversation's for you. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe and follow the Caregivers Podcast wherever you're listening or watching. It's completely free, and it's one of the best ways to support the show and help these conversations reach more caregivers and families who need them. Amy Goyer, welcome to the Caregivers Podcast. We're so thrilled that you're here today.
Oh, I'm so glad to be with you. Thank you for inviting me, Mark.
Well, in the tradition of the podcast, we're going to jump right in, Amy. And, most people expect caregiving to cost them time. They expect it probably to be a little emotionally exhausting, even physically. Very few expect it to threaten their financial future. Do you find that people actually have no idea what caregiving actually costs until they're actually living it?
Absolutely. I think it's a very difficult thing for people, first of all, to plan for because we don't know how someone's health is going to unfold. We don't know what their needs are going to be, so it's difficult to plan financially. We can plan in generalities and do the best we can. But for example, someone who ends up developing dementia is going to have care needs depending on the type of dementia over a long period of time and increasing care needs. They're going to need to have someone 24/7 eventually. And if you are planning, but you're not planning on that, you're not going to be prepared.
It's pretty hard to know what to plan for, but people often hear you should plan ahead. But caregiving doesn't usually unfold according to a plan. And, needs change overnight. Someone ends up in hospital. A diagnosis just changes everything. How do you prepare financially for something that can change in a moment's notice?
To plan financially, I think you need to plan for the big picture. So you need to have your basics taken care of if you're planning for your own caregiving, let's say. And you need to know that, you're going to be able to pay your mortgage if you have one, or if you're going to live in a senior community to pay for that. You need to have those things in place. And then you need to think about, okay, what additional care needs am I going to have? Might I need care at home? The vast majority of people do receive care at home, vast majority. So thinking about that, what are the costs of that? Who will provide care for me? How much can family do? How much are we going to have to pay? How much do I want my family to do? A lot of people think about that. And then you need to think again of long term. Will I need to be in a facility? All of these things that you don't know for sure, and you hope for the best. And a lot of people just hope for the best and bury their head in the sand. But if you can think about doing the best you can to plan and know that if this happens, here's what my plan is. If this happens, here's my plan B. I think, that's the best you can do. I'm going to give you an example. So
Sure.
my parents were really good about planning. My dad was a college professor, and my mom had worked. I think she went back to work when I was in third grade, and she worked many different jobs, and she got her master's degree, and she taught. And so they had, Dad had pensioned from 2 different university systems. He had Social Security. Mom had some Social Security, not as much. And they had gotten long-term care insurance fairly early on when policies were way better and less expensive. So that was great. They'd done that planning. They worked with a financial advisor, and he, helped them manage, their savings, investments, and things. So they felt like they had a really good plan. They had retired in Arizona. My dad had been teaching at Arizona State University, so they decided to stay there. They had a home that was all one level, so it was good for aging in place. And they felt they had their plan in place. My mom had had a stroke when she was only 63, so there have been many years of that, and Dad was her caregiver. Then Dad developed Alzheimer's disease. And my grandmother had had Alzheimer's disease, so he had some experience with that, which is, I think, part of what spurred him to get the long-term care insurance. So flash forward, he starts needing more help. I move out there to help. And they want to move to a senior community because we want him to stop driving. Okay, so stopping driving is a big factor financially because how are you going to get where you need to go? Do you have someone who can take you? Are you going to pay someone to take you? Or is there senior transportation available that's free or local? So he wanted to be in a senior community where they had transportation, meals prepared, that type of thing. So they made that move. Their budget just covered it. And we started getting their long-term care insurance because he qualified with his Alzheimer's disease, and Mom had more increasing care needs as well at that point. So between that long-term care insurance and their budget and everything, they could pay for that. In the meantime, though, their health got worse and worse, and they eventually needed 24/7 care. So after 3 years, we had to go to another plan. Well, they did have long-term care insurance, and they could have bumped up to an assisted living level, and it still wouldn't have been enough to cover the costs for both of them. And Dad couldn't be alone at that point. Like Mom could sit and watch TV and be alone for periods of time, but Dad couldn't. He would be constantly like, what should I be doing? What's going on? He had Alzheimer's. And so I would have had to pay somebody extra to be with them because they would have gotten kicked out of assisted living pretty quickly. So I moved them back in with me. That way, I was paying the mortgage. I bought the food. I started absorbing all those costs, and their budget went to paid caregivers while I was working, and I did evenings and weekends. So we were making that work, Mark, for a while, and then Mom passed away. So we lost her long-term care insurance payments. And at that point, my debt started to go up, and my parents started, their income, his income went primarily for his care and his medical expenses. And I paid for everything else. And that, I tell you this because then it was 6 years of that. He lived 6 years after Mom, or 5 years, I'm sorry, after Mom. Mom died after a year living with me. And that's a long time to be carrying that. And his care needs increased. And there were times we needed 2 people to get him up and out of bed and doing things. I did apply for veterans benefits, and that helped, but we didn't get that until the last year and a half of his life. So there was a real time there where he hadn't thought about veterans benefits. He hadn't planned for that. So I had to get him enrolled in VA healthcare and all of that. But, in the end, I ended up in bankruptcy because I absorbed all those costs. And it wasn't because they didn't do their best to plan. They could never have guessed when they were planning all those years ahead at the high cost of home care, of, paying individual caregivers to help them. And I think that's one of the trickiest things is the costs go up over time. So it does make planning difficult. That said, if they hadn't done any planning, think what a disaster the whole thing would have been at that anyway. And so, Dad didn't go on Medicaid. He had veterans benefits that, was better. But, some people can do financial planning and go on Medicaid, but not everyone will qualify in that way. So a long response to let you know that it's critical to do the planning, have as many contingencies in mind as you can. If this happens, I'll do this, and do the best you can.
It's a very powerful story, and I'm sure there are similar versions, varietals of this story, and then completely separately categorized stories about people's journeys. A couple of things resonate is that no one story is quite the same, but because of that doesn't really make planning any easier. And whether you read J.L. Collins or David Chilton or any of these individuals who've really been important in shaping a generation's worth of thinking about planning and financial discipline and all of these things, I don't think they could even actually come up with a foolproof plan on how to plan for this systematically if you really don't know what's going to happen. I mean, and to your point, caregivers don't make one big financial decision that gets them in trouble. They make hundreds of small decisions because somebody they care about and love needs them. So was that your experience? And when did you realize those small decisions were really starting to add up to something bigger?
Yeah, that's such a good point is, you do what you have to do. And I kind of turned on a dime and made changes in my life. The other thing that was critical factor for me was I was caregiving for 3 people at one time. So both my parents and my sister who lived in Maryland, and my parents were in Arizona, so long distance. And so that increases your expenses. Just even traveling to take care of her, to deal with it when she passed away, I had to empty her house. There were numerous trips to Maryland to get it emptied out, get it ready, sell it, and it sold for less than was owed on it. So I never got reimbursed any of that. Like those are factors that just, there's so much happening when you're caregiving, and my loved ones' needs were just increasing, and there was a hospitalization and a fall and a surgery and always something going on, and you just keep going, and as you say, then at some point you realize I'm losing control of this situation, financially. And I think it was about between a year and 2 years after my mom died when I started to feel a little panicky because I could see my debt going up, because I got in a point where I could only make minimum payments on those credit cards because I needed the cash to try and not charge more on credit card, to keep up with the expenses. And the expenses were increasing. I had quit my job so I could be an independent consultant. So I had to pay my own health care insurance. I had, all of those things going on as well. So my expenses had increased. And I had to rent an office when my parents moved back in with me. So all of these things were adjusting, and I would keep spreadsheets of everything, and I started seeing those numbers go up, and it's really hard to get that under control. So, I think I really came to a point where I started trying to get help, but I didn't really get the right kind of help, I think, financially. I was trying
Tell me
to
more about that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, my one regret is that I didn't get a financial advisor or a counselor to work with me on my finances. I worked with my parents. I worked with my parents' financial advisor on their money, and I had that all under control. But I didn't have somebody helping me and looking out for me. And so that was my big mistake. What I tried to do is I would go to the consumer credit counseling, and they would say, well, you should transfer to a zero balance credit card. Well, then you do that. And if you don't get it paid off by this certain time, then it's 30% interest, So those things I kept trying to kind of, put a finger in
Maneuver.
the hole and plug out the dike, but it wasn't working. And, it was right at the end of my dad's life when I was just, I was like, I don't know how to dig out of this. And then I went to new financial advisors and lawyers and everything. And they advised me that really the only thing I could do is bankruptcy. And it was a very humiliating, horrible experience. I mean, it's not a fun thing to go through bankruptcy, especially because I felt like a failure. But the thing that I came to realize is I am a caregiving expert. My parents got the best care. My sister got the best care I could possibly give her. And I'm not a financial expert. So my advice to caregivers is know what your strengths are. And, and I manage better than many, many people might, but it still, would have benefited me to have somebody who was saying, I think you should do this, try this, and then that might have helped me.
We hear a lot about caregiving and setting boundaries, and there's so many elements that could require boundaries, whether it's your self-care, your self-awareness, just your energy expenditure. But when it comes to caregiving and issues of the heart, it's very hard to set boundaries with someone you love. But for now, we're talking about financial caregiving boundaries, which bring it to a completely new dimension. And do you think that's almost foundational for self-care and survival as a caregiver?
I think it's really critical to think about that as a boundary. You can say, I can put this much into it, and after that, I can't. And I think that's really useful to do, and to think about that and think about your budget. The tricky thing is, though, if the need is there and they can't meet the need financially, the person you're caring for, and no one else in the family is pitching in to do it, what are you going to do? Sometimes you just have to do what you have to do. If I'm trying to think of some good examples, but if my parents had a certain need and insurance wasn't going to cover it, then I knew it would make them more comfortable, healthier, have a better quality of life, and make it easier to care for them, then I tried to find a way to do that. So I do think financial boundaries are a very useful idea and should be done. And I think that's something that maybe a financial advisor would have worked with me on, you know.
Yeah. Take us back to that time, Amy. What did your life actually look like day to day in that ramp up to where you had to look at making a big decision about declaring bankruptcy?
Well, the hardest thing was I had lost my niece, my mom, and my sister 3 years in a row. And then Daddy was with us 5 more years. And as his Alzheimer's increased, his skills got less. He needed more and more support. There was pneumonia, there was this, there was that, and just trying to keep all the balls in the air while dealing with, as I mentioned, all those other things, my sister's estate and all of those things. The grief was so immense, and yet you have to keep going. So we have the ambiguous grief of Daddy, going downhill, and the actual losses of all those family members. And so leading up to that financial stress was always in my head, always, always, always there. And you deal with what's in front of you so much. My caregiver calls in sick. I am working that day. How am I going to get my work done and take care of Daddy? Who can I get to come in? Can I get anyone to come in? Those kinds of things happen on a daily basis. There was always something, medication changes and, doctor's appointments and, all of those things. So you're dealing with managing care, you're dealing with hands-on care, you're dealing with the house needs a new roof or the air conditioning goes. And I had 2 properties to kind of deal with because I had kept my rental in the DC area because I had to go back for work periodically. And, you're just doing the next thing. And in the background is that financial stress. So as Daddy's life seemed to be coming more and more to a close, and of course you never know that, he was physically quite strong, but dementia was increasing. I knew I was going to have to deal with it, and I had started reaching out to some different advisors and looking into it when he passed away. And and then the grief was so much more constantly present because I had to kind of put aside my grieving process in a way to keep caring for Dad with all those losses.
To stay highly functioning. Yeah.
Yeah. And so dealing with that grief and trying to deal with this financial fallout at the same time, it was really hard. And I was lucky I found an attorney who was very empathetic and understood the situation and had done some caregiving and all of that. So they were very patient with me. But there were a lot of tears. There was a lot of grappling and trying to figure out anything else to do. And then it was a long process. It took a year before the bankruptcy was final. So,
what was it like day to day watching your bank account shrink, and then day to day, week after week, knowing that caregiving expenses weren't ending?
It was a constant adjustment. I was constantly trying to adjust. Can we save money here? Can we, do something there? How can I pay the bill this month? And it was definitely kind of one of those living month to month situations, and trying to meet all of those needs. And that's one of the that when we look at family caregivers and their spending, I was typical of many of them. I mean, I was paying the mortgage, and that is, caregivers spend a lot of their money on housing expenses. We AARP has a study that we looked at. Caregivers spend 26% of their annual income, more than $7,000 a year, and I spent far more than that. And 52% of that spending is on household expenses. So it's
And
not
that's the average, right?
yeah, 50, and it's not just caregivers coming in and paying a medical bill or paying paid caregivers. It's basic living expenses for many people. And 17% is medical expenses, 11% is personal care, and then other things after that. So important to keep in mind that I'm trying to just keep everything going, and realizing that there's not enough to go around. So how do you plug this hole and that hole and then another? I always think of a friend used to describe it as a leaky hose. I would plug up one hole and then spring another leak somewhere else, and a new need would arise.
I mean, you did such an amazing job as a caregiver, but looking back now, who or what were you angry at during that time?
I was angry at Alzheimer's. I hate Alzheimer's. I'm not a hateful person, but I was angry at the disease. That was really the only thing I felt anger at. There were times when I felt frustration, resentment, things like that, with trying to get other family members to help who couldn't. People have limitations, but you still feel frustrated. But in the end, the anger was at what the disease caused. If my dad hadn't had Alzheimer's, for example, he could have been alone for periods of time. He wouldn't have need 24/7 care for all those. I mean, it was like a decade. So, that made me angry.
You mentioned something there, but other family members have limitations. That's a bit of a prickly topic, because there's choices and then there's actual situations that limit their ability despite the desire to help. So can you sort of expand on that a little bit? Because we've heard from lots of listeners and on social media that family dynamics has a huge impact, and it's not just about limitations and that everybody wants to help, but they just can't. It's they choose not to, or they choose to be far away and just express opinions and, pound a fist on the table and say, this is how it needs to be done, while someone with mom and dad are the actual caregiver day to day.
Yeah. Yes. I moderate AARP's family caregiver discussion group on Facebook. So we have about 28,000 family caregivers. So this is a very common topic.
It is.
A lot. And there's frustration. And, I think one of the key things to think about is, what are people's strengths? There are people who the thought of hands-on care causes them so much anxiety that they will always try to find a way to avoid it. There are some people who are really good with finances, and they'll pay the bills from a distance, or, everybody has different strengths. So if you can play to those strengths and think of it as putting your team together, not everybody's going to do the same thing, people are going to do different things, that can be helpful. I think for me, I think what I tell caregivers most commonly is, try to be aware of how much energy you're expending and being mad at the people who aren't helping, and figure out if that's useful. Because when you're in a caregiving situation, it's all hands on deck. internally all hands on deck. You have to give yourself to it. Like you have to have all the energy you possibly can, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. You have to have that. And if you're giving away a lot of it by being mad at family members or someone who's not helping, then it's hurting you, but it's not really hurting them. So in the end, you have to let some things go and find other ways to build that team. And that may be paid services, volunteer services, services from the area agency on aging. There's a number of things that you can do. And I'm not saying, and that's magic, and then you have enough help, because it most of the time is not that way. You never have, and few people ever have enough help, but it can certainly improve the situation. So it's kind of like a puzzle you put together, and you're going to be one big piece of that puzzle, but maybe somebody else is going to come once every 3 months and stay a week with your loved one, and that's a small piece of the puzzle. And maybe you get respite care from the VA, and that's a piece. So you put it all together. There's no one way to do this, and I try to remind people that very, very few family caregivers can do this on their own, and many end up in that situation and they'll say, I have no help, no support. And sometimes it's because they choose that, in that they feel like it's their responsibility. I see this a lot with spousal caregivers. They feel like, I made a vow and this is my job. I have to do it. But nobody can do it forever, and depending on your caregiving situation. So it's important to accept help from people outside the family. And
Which is a skill in itself. Not everybody's good at accepting help.
Absolutely. Yeah, the other thing that we're offering are virtual caregiver support groups from AARP now. And I just had a big conversation this week in my group with them about accepting help. And that, either you don't because you feel like it's your duty, you don't because your loved one says they don't want anybody but you to provide the care. That's a big hurdle. And, how do you set that boundary and say, I want to do this, and so I have to take care of myself, and so I have to have help. And, all the different ways to think about accepting help. And one big one, too, is people grapple with that decision of, do I get paid caregivers? Do I have my loved one move to a facility, that type of thing? And you're still a caregiver when you're doing those things. Yeah, you're still coordinating the care. You're still, even if you're not providing all the hands-on care, you're still the leader of the team, and you're still caregiving. So I think it's important to have that perspective.
We have listeners from around the world now, and they may not be familiar with the AARP, but that's the American Association for Retired Persons, correct?
That's actually our former name.
So now it just goes, but now it just goes as IRRP.
AARP,
Okay.
yeah.
So, Amy, as you look back and with people you speak with, is caregiving usually a slow financial bleed, or can it drain a family's finances overnight?
Absolutely, it can, with medical bills, and primarily is when that happens. There's situations where people don't have adequate health insurance coverage. They don't, they're not prepared for a catastrophic health event that happens, and they end up getting huge medical bills. And some people are able to get assistance with those bills and get the bills down. Other people don't even realize that that's an option, or that they should look into options or try to propose something, payment plans, all that kind of thing. So that can be really devastating. The other thing that can happen is scams and fraud. So if your loved one falls victim to a scam, they may lose their entire life savings. And this happens more frequently than you would think. And it's absolutely devastating and heartbreaking. And it doesn't just happen to people who have dementia. It happens to very intelligent people. Scammers are professionals, and they have psychologists and everybody else on board trying to figure out how to target people and get them to do what they want. And I've met quite a few people who have lost their entire life savings, or a huge chunk of it. So then they don't have the resources when they need care. So those things can be very catastrophic for many people.
in that sort of catastrophic scenario, caregivers often burn through savings, then big chunks of their paychecks, then retirement savings. How quickly does that change a family's future?
Really quickly, and especially when you think about the retirement savings. And that was, you just described my situation, First I went through my available savings, and then the one thing I didn't do is I never touched my 401k, and I have a pension from former employer. So that's on my side. But going through all of this and then getting a financial planner and working with them that I do now, uh, you know, as soon as that savings was gone, then that puts me in a situation when you look and plan out what your retirement income is going to be, there's a huge missing chunk. And, we always talk about retirement planning in terms of, pensions. Not many people have pensions anymore, Social Security, and your investments and savings. And if you've got a whole one leg of that stool missing, and we used to talk about it as a stool, then you're going to topple over. So it can happen really, really fast. And that's one of my main concerns for caregivers to be, and I'm in that situation. I'm going to be working much longer than I would have otherwise. And I'm fortunate that I love my work and I can do that, but not everybody can do that. Many caregivers develop health issues because of the stress and the strain and not taking care of themselves, putting themselves at the bottom of the list. And then they can't keep working longer. They've depleted all those savings and investments, and they're in their 80s, and that's one of the most devastating things when you think about it. Caregivers have done this important job, saved our country billions of dollars, and
Trillions. Almost.
Right. And then here we are, and we cannot take care of ourselves. We don't have a care plan for ourselves. We don't have someone to step in and supplement our finances, or we don't have families who can help us. So that can be a real awakening. I think people generally, it kind of happens. You're chipped away at, and then suddenly you come to a realization that you're not prepared. And largely many people are not prepared for retirement anyway. And then you introduce a caregiving situation in, and that further depletes their reserves.
It sounds to me like even those who are, this can come as a shock and completely hit them sideways. It's almost as though, there's always a good time to engage with a financial planner at any time of your life if you haven't yet. But even if you've followed it, and you described that well initially in your story about your parents, they really did it by the book. But it's almost as though we need to have that midlife sit down with a new breed of planner who really can get into sort of the granular details of a couple of paths that might evolve, depending on family structure, depending on whether a partnership has children or not, depending whether both partners actually have long-term care insurance. That's something that really struck me from your story, is that it wasn't transferable. And suddenly that was a huge hole. And, the intent was great, but perhaps the foresight to have both insured wasn't, because it was a relatively new area of insurance at the time when they got it.
My parents both were insured. They both had policy.
I see.
But the problem was that their policies together paid for the caregiver who was there during that day and working. And when mom passed, then her share of that long-term care insurance, so half of it was gone. Yeah.
What's the hardest thing about caregiving when you're already living paycheck to paycheck?
Interesting question. I think the hardest thing about caregiving for me personally was having I love my family and I want them to be okay and I want them to have the best care. And that living paycheck to paycheck puts limits on you. And and it's always there in the back of your mind. So you're trying to it's constant decision making and constantly adjusting plans and trying to make the best choices you can at the time with the information you have. And that's really draining. I mean, that's the hardest thing. I think emotionally caregiving is really hard and stressful for many, many people. And you add that financial stress on top of it, and it can just really put you over the top.
I mean, there's so many different things that we carry on our shoulders. And once caregiving keeps you up at night, that's already a challenge. But throw this on top of it to keep you up at night, and it's almost unsustainable. I think a lot of people assume that if they keep mom and dad at home, they'll save money. But in your experience, what are the hidden costs of caring for someone at home that most families never see coming?
Yes, it's such a good point. When you look at the costs of care, when I was caring for my parents, so Daddy passed away in 2018, and so that was the end of that era of my caregiving. I have other caregiving responsibilities now, but different. And that at that time, it did cost less to pay caregivers at home than have them in the facility. As I told you, we made that choice, and especially because there were two of them, and we had both long-term care insurances in the beginning. What people don't realize is that the costs of care at home have gone up a great deal. So there's from between 2019 and 2024, there's been a 50% increase in the cost of home care and assisted living. And, the cost of nursing home care is always going to be the most expensive. But when you look at that increase, and if you start doing research on the costs of care, they're basing it on 44 hours a week. When you have somebody who needs 24/7 care, that's a different story. And especially people getting up at night, and so people don't always factor in the number of hours of home care they're going to need. And it's still maybe less expensive and more desirable in terms of the quality of care and the quality of life. But you got to look at the whole cost. And the other thing they don't think about is, like in our situation, my parents had a mortgage, so I had to still pay that mortgage. Some people, their home's paid off. That's a big factor. If they don't have a mortgage to pay or rent, then, that's a big factor in making that decision and that choice. But you also have to think about with caregivers coming in the home, what are you going to provide for them? Are you feeding them? Are they live-in caregivers who are going to spend the night? What do you have provided for them? And that was part of the cost for me. We had live-in caregivers, so we could pay them a little bit less, and they had a place to live for part of the time. And that saved a little bit on our hourly costs, but I was feeding them, and they're all those
Cost of relationship nurturing, right? If
yes, that's
it's
part
a
of it.
two-way street. You want them to feel invested in it, and you hope they invest in the care of your loved one equally.
Mm-hmm. Right. And, meals and medical equipment and certain things that might be provided in a facility, but they're often not provided in the facility either. So you have to look at what the actual costs are. And when if you look at assisted living, you have to not just look at a base price, because many of them have a la carte services. So as you have to increase care over time, those costs are going to increase as well.
We've touched on that too, even when looking for assisted living places. When we spoke with Janice Martin, things add up, and certainly don't underrepresent or don't underthink what your needs may be up front as you're planning your budget, but they can ramp up quickly. You talked about the team aspect, and some families, function as well-oiled machines. They're a really good caregiving team. But what are the expenses that tend to surprise families the most when they're already in the middle of caregiving?
I think medical expenses can be a surprise because people make a lot of assumptions about what Medicare covers when you're caring for older adults. And even for younger people who are not on Medicare, the insurance doesn't always cover things. You've got co-pays and you've got all kinds of situations there. medications that aren't covered at the full cost, so you have to pay a higher tier. An example, my dad had a medication for his Alzheimer's disease, and it was, he did not do well with the generic. It didn't work for him. I mean, I would see a huge downhill slide. So I had to pay extra. I think it was over $100 a month for him to get that brand name of that medication. You don't think about things like that. And then many people assume that people will just go on Medicaid. They just assume you get old, put them on Medicaid. I mean, I can't tell you how many people have said that. And it's because they don't understand Medicaid is for the poorest of the poor, and you can't always do Medicaid planning. Not everyone's going to qualify for those services, which may provide some in-home care, which will be great for some people, but the majority of people are not going to be in that situation. So there are a lot of assumptions about what's covered somehow, and not. And they also, when it comes to families, a lot of parents don't talk to their adult children about their financial situation. And so the adult children, all of a sudden you're in a caregiving situation and they have no clue what's going on or what their resources are. And so I think it's really important for families to have these conversations, if possible, long before the need is there, so that people are apprised. You never know. Someone can break a hip or have a fall or be in a car accident. Things can happen and people are thrust into this situation. So having the conversation about what resources do we have, what are our wishes, where do we want to be, all of those kinds of things are critical.
It's a hugely powerful move. And we recently had Beth Pinsker on and talking about specifically that to really bring it out into the open early. Have these conversations when you're feeling pretty well, when you're actually healthy, so that when those moments arise, everybody's not scrambling and almost blinded by just not having any direction.
Yeah. And it's also less intimidating. People don't want to talk about their eventual death and their eventual going downhill is the way a lot of people think of it and all of that. It's a lot easier to talk about it as someday if I need this, someday if I need that. Have those conversations when you're healthy and younger, when you possibly can, and then you adjust the plans because things change. Your financial situation can change, your health situation, your housing. You may decide to move, so you need to keep updating those conversations over time. I always say talk early and often.
Can you give us a sense of just how quickly those caregiving costs add up over the months or years? Is it sort of like just shooting up completely?
I think the costs are often around the needs. So you have to look at someone, are they in a healthcare situation where they're going to have gradually increasing needs for care, health care, and gradually increasing medical needs, all of those things over time. And then something can go up quickly when it's related to medical bills. You have some kind of a health crisis and you suddenly have a lot of more bills to pay. It can also be around housing. Their rent can go up. Their rent can go up. Their expenses for utilities can go up drastically. We've had some big utility increases in recent years. One thing that happened when I was caring for my parents after they moved back in with me, we lived in Arizona and you have to have air conditioning. And both of the air conditioning units went. At that time, that was like $8,000 a unit. Now they're like $14,000, $15,000 a unit. I mean, it's just something like that can be devastating when you've used all the reserves for their care. There's nothing to draw on to pay that. So you have to either take out a credit card and pay it over time, and then you got interest, and then get into that, or some kind of a payment plan. So catastrophic things can happen in all areas of your life. And by the way, that can happen to the caregiver. The caregiver can have a health crisis. The caregiver's home needs help. Your car cannot be fixed anymore. You need a new car. All of those regular everyday life things happen at the same time while you're caregiving. Caregiving doesn't happen in a vacuum. Life is going on. So you have to deal with those things. And because of your caregiving situation, you may not have the reserves that you had planned to have for those kinds of eventualities. And your loved ones' reserves may be depleted too. So it can creep up on you, but it can definitely happen fast as well.
I mean, people often assume that, well, we'll use mom's house, mom's savings, or other family assets to pay for care. But how quickly can those resources actually disappear once the caregiving expenses start mounting?
Well, they can appear, the caregiving reserves, the resources that you think you're going to be using can go really quickly depending on the care needs. So, for example, let's say you say you're going to do a reverse mortgage on the home to have the money to pay for the care. And the cost of hourly wages of caregivers at home goes up drastically, which it has, as I mentioned earlier, in recent years. And so what you thought was going to be enough to last a while runs out. It's not enough. And now the house has a reverse mortgage on it. It's not a resource anymore. And where are you going to get more? You don't have enough in your budget. Things like that can happen, and all of a sudden you're in a situation. And I think again, eh, so many eventualities can happen, and that's why financial planning can be very helpful to pull in. If this happens, this is my plan B, this is my plan C. If we do a reverse mortgage on the home, what are the repercussions? What are the pros and the cons? When am I going to run out of money? How long can this work? And then what will we do?
Different illnesses create very different caregiving challenges. And you've mentioned before the show that the cost of dementia caregiving is like caregiving on steroids. What makes dementia care so financially overwhelming?
Yeah, it really is. And it's in many cases, it's because it's over a long term. And if you have certain types of dementia, Alzheimer's, for example, tends to go over a long period of time unless some other health situation intervenes and shortens a life. So, my dad was probably at least 12 years with Alzheimer's in the very early stages. He was still driving and doing well, but gradually over time, those care needs increase. And that's, I think, the biggest factor is the length of time with it. And the second factor is that they eventually get to where they can't be left alone. So there's no option of eventually, there's no option. Someone's going to come in for 3 hours in the morning and 3 hours at night. You don't have to have someone 24 hours. That eventually becomes not an option. They cannot be left alone. And that's the other big factor. And so you have to think about that really practical aspect of it. For me, there was also the factor of trying to mitigate the difficult behaviors, the dementia, the sundowning, the anxiety that comes with it. And so we did things like my dad, when he retired, he had started working out with a trainer and getting a massage once a week and taking good care of himself. He was 72 when he retired. And he was in his 80s. He was probably 12 years later, started showing some early signs of dementia. And so we kept that going. And one of the things I noticed was when he had that massage, he had a cognitive boost for the rest of the day and for the next day, like that. And I'm not a researcher and I'm not a doctor and I don't exactly know why that is, but we saw it. And he was happier and easier to take care of and more verbal and all kinds of things. So that was something I kept going. The other thing was after my mom died, we went to acupuncture because it helped with the emotions in a way that he couldn't do talk therapy or any kind of, he was grieving, but couldn't process it in the same way. And that the acupuncture process helped immensely with his anxiety and his grief and really kept him going. And we worked with the Chinese medicine doctor on herbs to take when he would get very worked up. Whereas many people they're trying to find a medication that will do that, a prescription medication. And these were traditional Chinese medicine is for them, and she prescribed these herbs for him, but I call them herbs because they're, it's traditional Chinese medicine. But Dad didn't do well with any kind of psychotropic medications, or things that were supposed to calm him made him worse. He'd be bouncing off the
Paradoxical
wall,
agitation. Yeah.
And so his brain just did not process those medications that way. But this traditional Chinese medicine helped. Now, for him, that was critical. It made it possible for us to take care of him at home where we wanted him to be, and made his experience so much better, his life. So, but I had to pay for that. So the extras are choices, and they're difficult choices when you're struggling financially. So you have to weigh, this is going to help us get through the day and sleep at night and things like that, which are critical to come through and not have your entire breakdown.
Huge indirect cost savings. Yep.
Yeah.
So when families can't afford professional help, someone usually has to step in and fill the gap. How do caregivers manage trying to hold down a full-time job while also being at the bedside in the area?
I will tell you it's easier than it used to be, only because working from home and flexible work arrangements are getting more and more common. That I was very fortunate, and that was the reason I became a consultant, so I would have that flexibility. And I worked full-time the whole time. My mom at one point was hospitalized for 40 days and nights, and I was there all but, I think, 5 nights. My sister relieved me, and I worked on the couch, the little chair thing in her hospital room every day on my computer, because I could do that. And I think more people are having that flexibility. I was just talking to a caregiver today who she's got 2 adult children with special needs, and she's got her aging mom. And so she's sandwiched between the two. And she was saying,
Wow.
her one year, her daughter was hospitalized 5 times. And she kept working through the whole thing because she'd have her laptop, and she had that flexibility and was able to do that. So that's a big help. Flexible work options, flexible work locations. I've known people who get transferred to a different job site because it's closer to where their loved one lives that they're caregiving for. And they can go check on them on their lunch break, or they can do certain things they need to do, not have as long of a commute. There are things like job sharing, where you might say, I need to cut back to part-time, but I don't want to stop working and lose my job. And somebody else wants to work part-time too, so you share a job. Some people go through things like phased retirement. They start cutting back their hours. They're not ready to retire, but they need the time for caregiving. We're trying to educate employers about all of these options that can help them keep valuable employees that are absolutely critical to the workforce, and not let them leave the workforce, because it doesn't help employers or the employees to completely leave the workforce for caregiving. Employees stand to leave over $300,000 in lifetime benefits and wages if they quit working for caregiving.
What's interesting is there is some data emerging from larger corporations now where they've actually done some analytics, and it's actually showing that more flexible approach to a caregiver employee actually allows them to caregive better, but it also improves productivity at work when they are there. And the numbers may actually work in favor of that thinking, which I think is really hope producing, if anything, just giving us some inkling of how change can occur. And I think when we look at ground zero when it comes to caregiving across our, North America and the world, that kind of fuel for hope for change makes it feel within reach. But what happens financially when the only option left is reducing hours, taking unpaid leave, or leaving work altogether?
Well, as I mentioned, if you leave work altogether, you're going to lose a lot of lifetime benefits and wages, a huge amount of value there. Sometimes people can cut back to part-time, and works for them, but that means they're not having the income they would have the caregivers are not. And so they're not putting the money into savings for retirement. They're not taking care of their own financial security. If they're not ready, if they can't really swing working part-time. And sometimes some people are afraid to do that, then it puts their job in jeopardy. Sometimes some employers say it's a full-time job and it's not a part-time job, so you just lose your job if you can't work full-time. So you have to look at what the options are. And but I think it's also important to note that I know for me and for many caregivers, they say work is our respite. It's our little bit of a brain break from the caregiving things. So being able to focus on something else, it's a really good life balance thing. And I think if employers can understand that and see it as a balance, but you're never in perfect balance, but you're kind of constantly adjusting to, okay, they have caregiving responsibilities that are very important and committed to that, and work that they're very important and committed to, and that's okay. You can have, it's not that if you have anything else going on in your life, you can't be a good employee. You can. So if you can find ways to continue working, sometimes people change jobs. They take a less stressful role, for example, where, they can, in fact, my dad was an example of that. My mom had that stroke when she was about 63. And she was not working. Dad was chair of the communication department at ASU. So he had a stressful, responsible job. And he stepped down as chair sooner than I think he would have otherwise. He continued to teach, less stressful, less responsibility, because he had to do more for mom. So sometimes people do that. They'll just take a less stressful role that may be less time consuming or even just mentally stressful because you've got all these responsibilities swimming around. But you don't have to do that. I think there are many people who have very responsible jobs and they manage it. And the difference is the support they get. Are they getting counseling? Are they getting part of a caregiver support group? Many employers offer employee resource groups that are focused for caregivers. So you get to know who you're working with who's also in a caregiving situation, and you help and support each other. Employers who make sure that their employees understand the benefits they have available to them if they do need to take leave, like Family Medical Leave Act or paid leave. We trying to see, we're encouraging employers, and AARP is advocating for paid family leave laws across the country.
Right.
And we're seeing those increase.
And there's movement, right?
Yeah,
and
there really is.
I've also read about different states coming out with certain, tax credits for caregiver. Like there's movement on a lot of fronts, which is really refreshing to see.
Yes.
But as I'm sure you'd understand, burnout doesn't come with an invoice. And it still has that huge financial cost. How does burnout quietly actually become a financial problem?
Because we are unable to function when we're in burnout. It affects the way that we function. So it affects our decision making. It affects our health. It affects our mental capacity and our emotional capacity. All of those things. It basically eats away at a person when you're really in a burnout situation. So you're not as efficient, and you may struggle to actually do a good job at anything. So it's really important to identify burnout. And I think it's critical to focus on what's leading up to burnout. What are the red flags that start coming up that I'm getting to a point where I'm going to fall over the edge? And one example I can give you, I know, is when you start to see changes in yourself. I'm not a yeller. It's just not who I am. And I can remember one time being on the phone. The lab had messed up my mom's lab test. And in the back of my head is, if I have to take her back to the lab, that means I have to get mom and dad's service dog in the car in the heat. It's 120 degrees outside. I have to get them to the lab. I have to get them out of the car. I have to get mom back there. Then I have to get her to do the sample. Then, all of these things are in the back of my head. And so I was concerned about her health situation. So that there's a lot of fear in there that was creeping up into me. And I was yelling at this person on the phone. And I just don't do that. And I hurt myself doing it. I thought, this is not me. And she put me on hold and I thought about it. And I thought, what am I doing here? And I realized it was fear. It was mostly coming from fear. And I thought, what would the and I thought, what would the opposite be? I would be love. So what does love do? Love solves the problem and moves on, So I was able to come back and say, okay, let's just figure this out. But that was a red flag for me because I was not myself. And I realized I had too much stress. I had too much, and I at the time I made a bit of a change in our care plan. And I also started once a week working, going to Pilates, doing something for myself, and I was able to work that out with the caregiving schedule and all of that. But you have to see, that's a red flag, but there's also red flags like not paying your bills. Your finances going downhill. There's red flags like relationships falling apart, your other relationships in your life. Your health is suffering. You're not sleeping. Sleep is number one priority. You cannot cope. You can't function. You can't have good health when you're not getting good sleep. And you have you lose your patience, all of that goes. So if you're not sleeping well, I think it's really critical to be aware of that and try to do something to adjust things so you can sleep better. Be aware of how you're dealing with if you're working. What is your attitude towards your work? Are you starting to dread it? Because just because it's more to do, then, okay, what do we need to adjust in our situation? Because I do want to work and I love my work, but why am I dreading it? So just being very self-aware. I wrote a publication for AARP called Care for the Caregiver, and that's available as a free download on the AARP website. And I put a list there of things to watch out for. And including if you start to have depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, reaching out for help is absolutely critical. And one of the best things you can do is connect with other caregivers, truly, in a virtual caregiver support group or an in-person one, Facebook groups, online groups, any kind of way. Because what I find, and again, I'm interacting with caregivers every day, what I find is that as soon as they feel validated, like somebody gets it, this is hard what I'm going through, and I'm not making it up, and it's not, they feel better. There's like a release, and maybe we haven't solved the problem for you, but you have been heard and noticed.
Authenticated. Yep. We see that too often just with some of the comments we receive, and it's just like a 3-letter word. Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Amy, do caregivers sometimes become so burned out and depleted that they can't any longer make clear financial decisions?
Absolutely. Burnout and stress and lack of sleep and all of these things can affect how we think and the ability to actually get through it. And we might make poor decisions. And I probably did make some poor decisions, in terms of financially by not getting more of a financial advisor because I was just doing the best I could from minute to minute, So I think, burnout affects every aspect of our life, including financial, health, emotional, relationships, mental, everything.
Folks, we're going to take a little break, and in the tradition of the podcast, I get a chance to hear from our illustrious production crew who always have a couple of good questions for our guests.
So I've noticed in preparing for this episode, and also in some of the other conversations that we've had around financial caregiving, that it's typically framed from a middle class perspective. There's some assumption that there are going to be resources, like even in this episode, if you have mom's house to sell, or you have this or that, or you're going to be sort of burning through savings. When we speak about what this looks like at the poverty line or below the poverty line, it seems like just a completely different experience, even if there are things in common that we all go through with burnout and all of the sort of the normal things that come with caregiving. But the experience below the poverty line is typically the only thing we really hear from people is Medicaid. Obviously, if you're in the United States, what does this look like dealing with these issues when you have absolutely zero resources to start with?
Well, if you have absolutely zero assets and low income, Medicaid is an option, and you may qualify for Medicaid. And keep in mind that Medicaid's a federal program, but it's administered by the states. So states have different requirements. So you might qualify in one state and not another. So it's important to find out in your own state. And Medicaid can be a huge help if you are at that point. And there are Medicaid planners that can help you look ahead and try to plan for a time when you might need to qualify for Medicaid. It can happen especially for people who are living in a facility, for example, that type of thing. But keep in mind that Medicaid isn't everything. Like, you get a certain number of hours of care in the home that can be really helpful in some states if they have Medicaid waivers for in-home care. But it may not be 24/7 care. So if you've got somebody who can't be alone, somebody still has to deal with that, be with them. And I heard lots of stories of people. And my partner, he was a captain in the fire department, and he would tell me stories all the time of going into people's apartments. And, they had care workers during the day, but they won't have anybody there at night because they had no family who could come in and do it, and they didn't have any money to pay anyone. So that Medicaid can be a huge help, but it doesn't answer every problem. And if your income is low enough to qualify for Medicaid, you probably don't have money for anything that's not covered. And, whether it's a better wheelchair cushion or, there are all kinds of things that come up. Incontinence products are a huge expense, huge. And sometimes that can be provided. My dad was a veteran, and the VA ended up providing some incontinence care products for us, but they weren't always the greatest ones and didn't always work. So then I had to buy additional things. If you're a really, really low income, you don't have the money to do that. So there's that level. And then the people who are just above qualifying for Medicaid, they don't qualify for Medicaid. They're still very low income. They don't even have the Medicaid resources, and they have, not much of anything to pay for any care. And you think about people who are living alone in that situation. Sometimes they have great neighbors who look out for them, but many people suffer and don't have anyone looking out for them. And, care is a choice. People think they have no choice. Sometimes they say they have no choice to care for someone because there's no one else to do it. It's still a choice. I've seen people over my past 40 years who don't have anybody looking out for them, can't afford to pay for care, and it's not because they don't have family somewhere. They're choosing not to do it. So it's a really, really tricky situation to be in that low. And that's why you hear so much about middle income, because those people fall through the cracks too. You still may have a little bit higher income, but it's still not enough to pay for the care that you need.
Mm-hmm. It does sound like there's a huge gulf, though, between what a middle class experience of this might be from when we have no one and no resources whatsoever. Is there a massive difference in the quality of care that's taking place?
It really depends on the situation. Sometimes people who do qualify for Medicaid and have home care workers can get some good quality care, but not always. And I hear a lot from family caregivers who their loved ones on Medicaid, and they qualify for assistance, some home care in the home, and they can't get anybody good. I just there was someone in the Facebook group that posted this week, and she said, "What am I going to do? The caregiver they sent couldn't even she gave some really specific examples, like How do you turn on the oven? Where are these dirty dishes and they're in the drying rack, clearly clean? Like things that are kind of like, okay, common sense. So they send somebody to care for your loved one who can't even deal with those kinds of things, much less can you trust them to take care of your loved one's personal needs and make sure they're taking their meds? So you don't always get great quality care. Sometimes you do. And there are amazing caregivers out there that are employed through Medicaid and everywhere else. But it's not a guarantee. And then there is a worker shortage. So it doesn't matter what your income level is. If you are having paid caregivers come in and there's nobody to come, they don't have anybody to send, they can't find enough workers. People call in sick or say they don't want to work that day, there's nobody else to send. And so that's another factor affecting, you could be the wealthiest wealthy, and if you can't find somebody to do the work, then you're in trouble. And that happens across the board.
Thanks for answering my question.
Sure.
It sounds like there's a bit of a profit over people creep that can sometimes enter that equation as well. Are you witnessing it even at that level?
Oh, sure. It's always going to be a factor in terms of care provision and facilities. And I'm not an expert a business expert in terms of how these organizations are set up, but you do have to look at, okay, how much, and many times with home care agencies, sometimes the care worker, the direct worker is not getting paid that much, but you're paying more. So you may be paying $35 an hour, but how much is the actual care worker getting paid? And that's a factor in terms and what kind of line do they have for increasing their income or moving up the ranks, or what's their progression path? And if there isn't one, then that may not be something they want to do. So we need to really work on better conditions for these workers so that people are attracted to these jobs, valuing them. They're critical care workers, and it shouldn't be seen as the lowest level of the rung type of job. It should be seen as the actual base of what we need. And the same is true of unpaid family caregivers. We need to be seen. We are the backbone of the long-term care system and need to be seen that way and valued. It's over $600 billion of value in the care that unpaid family caregivers are providing.
We're back from some really meaningful engagement with our production team. We always like this feature on the show. Amy, I couldn't help but think while I was listening to you, at what point does choosing to help someone you love become financially dangerous for the caregiver?
That point can come really quickly for some caregivers, and it can take a while for others, like it did for me. It depends on what your financial security is going into the situation, how much you're having to pay for, out-of-pocket expenses, and if you change your work situation. All of those things are factors. So how quickly it happens is going to really depend on the unique individual situation.
But I think with coming to that point where you truly choose to dedicate yourself to someone you love as a caregiver, you need to stop. And I think this is probably one of the most important messages I've heard from you today is that stop, breathe, and sit down. And if you can't plan yourself, do a midlife plan or a caregiver plan, something we've barely ever read about, didn't come out in the books generations ago, but it's real today, and it's a growing population today.
Absolutely. People are living longer, but with chronic illnesses. So when people did financial planning in the past for retirement, they didn't always think about including the costs of their care. And, that's more a part of financial planning now than it used to be. And it's great if you are looking for someone to help you with this type of planning. Try and find somebody who really has a realistic viewpoint of those costs. And I think so we have a little bit more realistic view, but what we don't do is plan for when we are the caregiver. There's planning that people do for their own retirement and maybe their own care when they're older. But what about planning for the years that I may be caregiving? And I know I certainly didn't plan that way, even though I knew I would probably be the one to help in some way. And this is where I talk about, we all kind of hope for the best and bury our heads in the sand, but that's not always going to work. So
we need a bit of that, but at the same time, I think it's a really important sort of new call to action for caregivers everywhere. Take a step back, take a breath, and delve in a little bit.
Yeah.
Is there a point where helping someone you love really starts putting your future at risk, even though emotionally you don't feel like you have any other choice? Is there a financial point of no return?
I think that's a good question for a financial advisor. I think when you start depleting savings that are for your own financial security, especially in the future, that when you start depleting those things and you reach a point where you realize it's going to affect what you're going to have in the future, when you realize, okay, this is going to mean I'm going to have to work 5 more years than I would have otherwise. Can I do that? Am I willing to make that exchange? I was able to do that when I first went out to Arizona to care for my parents. I was 48, I think. I had a lot of working years ahead of me. And I think in my mind, I just kept thinking, I can work my way out of this. I can handle this. I can do this. Not everybody can do that. Caregiving comes at all different ages. We have caregivers who are 18, 20, 25 years old as well. So at what point are you in your life, and how are you looking at your working years and your savings and years getting money? So yeah, I don't know that there's one point. No, there's no dollar amount I can tell you that, okay, now you're in trouble. But again, that's where a financial advisor can be really helpful because they might be able to point that out. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons I didn't have a financial advisor is because I didn't want to spend the money on it. I kept thinking, I need to pay that money on a bill. I can't do that. Looking back, it would have been the best money I could have possibly spent. And I wish I would have made some slightly different choices in that regard.
Maybe it's relying on high interest credit cards, maybe it's something else, but what are the warning signs that tell you a caregiver has really crossed the line and is putting their own future at risk?
Well, when you're constantly stressed about money is a big warning sign. That's a red flag. When you start, what's the saying? Robbing Peter to pay Paul. You take money from this to cover this, and then you can't do this. And okay, I'm not going to pay the electric bill. I'm going to pay the electric bill late so I can pay the gas bill, or you're moving things around like that. I think that's kind of a red flag to be aware of. And caregivers do this on a regular basis just to get through the month. Okay, how am I going to do this? When can I pay this? And absolutely, when the credit card debt is such a big problem these days because interest rates can be 30% or more, and there's no limit on that. They can do that, and then you're never going to pay it back. And they can be raised arbitrarily at different times, and that can be a big red flag. That was obviously a big thing for me. And I think many caregivers, and I got to say, Mark, the reason I talk about this so openly is because I know I'm not the only one. And people don't talk about money. Money is like a taboo topic,
Historically, it is.
It's very private, and and I have limits on, what I will talk about, but I want to make it clear that I know I'm not the only one, and I've had caregivers come up to me and say, thank you for sharing that. I went through that too, but I've never told anyone. And then you carry that with you, and it's shame. And, I'm not ashamed of what I did for my family. I'm glad I did. I don't have regrets in terms of that. But there is shame in having financial challenges. And I'd like to remove that shame because you're doing the best you can. And instead, try to access any kind of financial counseling or supports that are out there.
We teach our children, don't put and buy flashy stuff and put it on high interest credit cards because you're just fooling yourself. But imagine being in the scenario where acts of caregiving and acts of love require you to do that, and the existential dilemma you face. It's very humbling.
It's like quality of care. It's like I was telling you about the things that made Dad's journey easier and made it possible for us to care for him at home. Cost money. Yeah, everything costs money. And so that's a choice to make. And many people would not have made that choice. And the whole situation would have dragged them down even faster. And I could have done that, and maybe I should have done that. But at the same time, I was, making that choice. There's an element of love and caring, and there's an element of survival, literally survival. And if this is going to make it possible for me to keep going day to day, sometimes you have to do those things. And again, go back to my story about the air conditioners. I'm not talking about I was going out and charging up credit cards on ridiculous things. When you have to have home repairs, you could have an electrical repair in your home. It's bam, $5,000. These things come in, and when you've depleted your reserves because of caregiving, you don't have the money to do those things that are essentials that you have to do.
You alluded to earlier, one of the hardest things about caregiving is that nobody really knows how long it's going to last. How do you make good financial decisions when you have no idea how long the caregiving journey is going to last?
You do the best you can, and you reevaluate periodically. You keep reevaluating. You keep adjusting as time goes on. With Dad having dementia, who knows? He had a heart condition. He could have died in 2 years or lived for 20. And so as you go along, you have to just keep adjusting and keep, evaluating what you can do, what's changed. I think one of the things that I want to mention that often is not talked about are all the benefits that might be helpful. So, for example, I mentioned Dad ended up getting veterans aid and attendance benefits that helped pay for his care. But I enrolled him in VA healthcare, and that meant he was eligible eventually for home-based primary care, which was a huge help. And those folks they were the ones that said, oh, well, you can get some incontinence products. Oh, well, you can get some medical equipment. You can get ramps. You can do, these things that I would have been spending my money on. So that wasn't until the end of his life. I wish I'd done that sooner, but those things can be available. It might be that someone qualifies for HEAP, help with their their energy bills. And that can lower that expense. So you adjust things better. It might be that they qualify for SNAP or some type of nutrition benefits. Meals on Wheels for older adults can be a huge cost savings for a lot of families. And that can, you get a home delivered meal, you get a decent food, and it's low cost or no cost. There's all kinds of benefits like that to look into and make sure that you're really maximizing what I think of as the income that way. What have you got going to, and lowering your expenses as much as you can. And that's a big part of that whole financial plan. And being aware of your loved ones' income, assets, all of those things is going to be part of applying for those things. And there's help out there. Many of the area agencies on aging in the U.S. at least have people who are specifically designated to help you with benefits applications, or at least educate you about what the options are.
So some consultation regarding elder care and benefits, and there too, a 1-hour consultation could be a great opportunity cost with a good return on the investment. I like your idea about reevaluating as you go. And, facing the challenges of caregiving and the financial challenges that come with it, we can get pretty hard on ourselves, and our caregiver's inner critic may be a very powerful voice. But I think reevaluation and being aware that you're consciously reevaluating as you go could be really good fuel for a caregiver's self-compassion and grace.
Absolutely. Listen, nobody is a perfect caregiver. And I don't know anybody who's a perfect financial manager either. So you give yourself some grace. You constantly adjust. You make the best decisions you can with the information you have at the time. And you can always make another decision in the future.
Now, how can you prevent caregiving from just taking everything? Like if someone's at the beginning of this journey, what are the most important things they can do today to protect both the person they're caring for and their own financial future?
Well, first is to look at the person you're caring for, their financial situation. Get a good handle on their income, their resources, their assets, their budget, their expenses. Then do your research about the costs of care. So if your idea is that they want to stay in their home, okay, if they need this amount of care, how much would that cost right now? If they need something else, how much would that cost? If you're thinking they want to go to assisted living, what in their area or in your area, what are the costs? Because that can vary greatly across the country. So get some realistic information about the costs of care and the options of care. You can hire caregivers directly. You can hire through an agency. What are the pros and cons and the benefits of all of those things? And so looking at those things is really critical in terms of making a realistic budget, but also just a plan, a caregiving plan. Then look at your own situation, your own resources, your own finances. What if I have to take time off work? What are my options? Am I going to have to take it off without pay? What would I do if that was the situation? How would I pay my bills? Looking at, people who know about Family Medical Leave Act, well, they may be able to take some time off, but it may not be paid. So
Right.
If you have to do that, can you handle it? Can you handle a lower paycheck or no paycheck for a while, or however that might work for you?
Most means like sitting down and going through some credible scenarios. And, while a care or future care recipient or new care recipient, so to speak, is able to engage in the conversation, actually have some talk about compromise and boundaries and what they value and what they might be willing to sacrifice if difficult decisions need to be made. Because their answer could be, oh, don't worry about that. I would never want that. It's expensive and it really doesn't mean that much to me. Yet as a caregiver, you want to give them everything. And if you only ask up front that they really don't value that, that could be important in shaping how you think as a caregiver when lots of competing priorities are facing each other.
Absolutely. I've heard so many people say, if I need care, just put me in a facility. I don't want to do this to my children. I want them to have to take care of me. But they have no concept of how much that's going to cost. They don't understand that you don't just go to a facility. You have to pay for it. And how's that going to be paid for? So have a realistic view of it. And I think, we've talked a lot about the fact that caregiving situations unfold, health unfolds. We don't know how it's going to go for sure. But doing this kind of planning and thinking about it ahead of time and really just spending some thought on, do I have boundaries? What are my boundaries? What am I willing to do? What am I not willing to do? Can help you be a little more prepared. If that time does come, you'll have some thoughts about it. You'll have some background. You'll have maybe some discussions about that already. It may be that when you're there, you feel differently about it, or your situation is different by the time that happens. But you at least have given it thought and you've communicated around it with your loved one that you would be caring for.
These are strategic boundaries. These aren't selfish boundaries. Lest anyone be confused, this is what can make or break it. Amy, I'm so glad you were here with us today, and thank you so much. Looking back on everything that you've lived through, if you could sit across from a caregiver today who feels like they're slowly losing everything, what would you want them to know?
I would want them to know they're valued and acknowledged, and that many, many people know how hard it is and what they're going through and can empathize. And then I would want them to know that there's help, that there are support groups and caregivers and care managers and other people who can help them think through how to get out if they're feeling stuck, how to move forward. What can they do? Maybe do something differently, whether it's to get more help or get a different benefit or get a different situation. I want them to know that, I'm not one to say they're not alone, because I've been alone caregiving. I've been in those little hospital cubicles in the ER for hours and hours, and people say, "Oh, you're not alone." I'm like, "Yeah, I'm alone physically, but I'm never without support." And that's what we need to know, that we're not alone in terms of people understanding and people who want to support us. And it's just connecting with the right people and the right resources and the right organizations like AARP and the area agencies on aging and all of the organizations that can be helpful. And that, there may be something or multiple things that can help and alleviate their stress, whether it's mentally, emotionally, physically, financially, to help them get through this.
Plan. Be kind to yourself when you recognize your knowledge gaps, and choose to not be alone. Thank you for joining us, Amy. This wraps up another episode. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Ropoleski, and this is the Caregivers Podcast. One of the hardest truths about caregiving is that love does not always come with limits. Many caregivers will sacrifice their time, their health, their careers, and sometimes even their financial future because they cannot imagine doing anything else. But caring for someone you love should never mean losing yourself in the process. Amy, thank you for sharing your story so openly and for helping caregivers understand that financial struggle is not a sign that they've failed. It's often one of the hidden costs of caring deeply for someone else. And to everyone listening, if this conversation helped you feel seen, please share it with another caregiver who may need to hear it. And until next time, take good care of yourself, because you matter. Before you go, please take a moment and subscribe to the Caregivers Podcast wherever you're listening or watching. It's free and it helps us out tremendously. Leave us a review. Send us your comments. Share your thoughts. We're waiting to hear from you. Before we wrap up, I wanted to remind you of something important. The conversations you hear on this podcast are here to inform, to support, to spark reflection. They're not a substitute for professional medical advice, care, therapy, or crisis services. Listening to this podcast does not create a doctor-patient or caregiver-client relationship between us. If you're facing a medical concern, health challenge, a mental health challenge, or a caregiving situation that needs guidance, I encourage you to reach out to a qualified professional who knows your story. If you're ever in crisis, please don't wait. Call your local emergency number or recognize crisis hotline right away. You deserve real-time help and support. The views you hear on this show, whether from me or my guests, are our own. They don't necessarily reflect any organizations we work with, or are part of, or have worked with, or been part of in the past. This podcast is an independent production. It's not tied to any hospital, university, or healthcare system. Thank you for being here, for listening, and most of all, for taking the time to care for yourself while you continue to care for others. I look forward to hearing from you.